Hey everybody, thanks very much for joining our School Medicaid Luncheon Hour today. Our topic today is parental consent, regulations, and strategies. Now today also happens to be Bathtub Party Day. I want to say right up beginning here, a lot of times when I mention some of these days, these special holidays, Apple Strudel Day or Take Your Kid to Work Day or something like that, some of you send me photographs. Today's holiday, Bathtub Party Day, I want no pictures. Please, no pictures. Hey, I'm Bob Bundy. I'm your presenter for today's session. Here's my contact information. I encourage people to call or email me if they have questions or comments about the topic after today's session. Now, I have to say, I get more questions and have more conversations about today's topic than any other single topic during the school year. So if you do have questions or comments today, please drop me a message or give me a call after the session today. Now, if any of you are new to the Luncheon Hours and you're interested in receiving automatic emails on upcoming Luncheon Hours, go out to our website, go to the Events tab, and over on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a place where you can give us your contact information. And anytime we schedule Luncheon Hours in the future, we'll just send you an automatic email telling you about them. Now, we don't use your information for anything else. We're not going to give your information away. We're not going to call you and try and make a sales call or anything like that. We just use it to get word out about school Medicaid. Today, I have a lot to cover, a lot more than normal on parental consent, because there's been a real increase in states changing their state Medicaid programs as a result of the change in free care guidance from CMS a few years ago. So we're talking about a lot more in the parental consent world. Again, I'm going to go really quickly today to try and stay within our 30 minutes. So if you have questions, give me a call after the Luncheon Hours today. I have two main objectives. First, I'm going to present an overview of these consent regulations as they pertain to Medicaid billing. We're going to cover both IDEA-based services. Those are services you're being reimbursed for, and they're listed on kids' IEPs. And second, we'll talk about free care. Well, I'll talk and you'll listen. I'm going to talk about free care services and consent. Those are reimbursable services that your school district is delivering, but they are not listed on any kid's IEP. And normally when I talk about parental consent, I talk about parental consent and eligibility checking. Unfortunately, with the 30 minutes limit that we put on the Luncheon Hours, I'm not going to have an opportunity to do that. But if anybody wants to talk about parental consent and eligibility checking, because it's a little bit different than the billing side of things, just give me a call after the session. More than happy to talk about it. The second objective for today's session is to give you some strategies that you can use to achieve 100% of parents granting consent for billing. Now, 100% of consents has a huge impact on your program's revenue. So I'll share some strategies that school districts have shared with me over the years that they've used to increase their parental consent percentage. Now, I'm going to start out by apologizing real quick. There are a couple slides in here that have a lot of text on them. And normally I don't do that. Any of you who've seen me present in person or you're regular Luncheon Hour visitors, you know I don't like to have a lot of text on slides that you have to read. Unfortunately, there are a couple slides in here that kind of require that, and I'll give you a heads up as we get to it. First, why do you need to have parental consent around school Medicaid billing? Well, as a public school district who participates in school Medicaid, you're going to be disclosing student information to your state Medicaid agency, and that's the term the operative term here is disclosing. That's information about these students that you're sending to your state Medicaid agency. And if you're complying with third-party liability requirements in your state or TPL, you might also be disclosing that information to insurance companies. And there are rules around those disclosures. They refer to parental consent, and that's why we're here going through this today. So first I'm going to talk about consent and IDEIA services. Okay, these are related medical services that are listed on a student's IEP. You are providing those services and you're submitting information about those services as part of your school Medicaid program. So a little bit of background real quick. IDEA Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act was the special ed law enacted in 1997. It was reauthorized in 2004, renamed Individuals with Disabilities in Education Improvement Act, IDEIA. So it's IDEA, and that's what a lot of people talk about it today, but we're under IDEIA. Now, for the very first time, special education regulations had something to do about parental consent in IDEIA 2004. And so basically, here's what it said. Parental consent around school Medicaid. Let me clarify. First time that special ed regulations really talked about school Medicaid, and they were kind of focused on parental consent. Basically, it said each time a school district accesses public health benefits, which is Medicaid, they have to have parental consent. Well, it seems kind of straightforward. It's the first time it was ever in education regulations, but that term each time, which I have in quotation marks because that is the term from the regulations, actually caused a lot of confusion. What does each time mean? Does that mean if I see a student 3 times this week for speech therapy services, I have to get 3 separate parental consents? What if I have a student who has 4 reimbursable services on his IEP? Do I have to get 4 separate parental consents? So it actually caused a lot of confusion and a lot of ambiguity. But fortunately for everybody, the Department of Education clarified it with a final regulation. Unfortunately, it took them 9 years to do that. Came out in 2013. They clarified what each time meant, what the parental consent regulations were under IDEIA. There are 2 components, and I'm going to go through those really quickly here. There is a notice notifying parents about the school Medicaid program, and then there's the actual consent itself. Parents granting consent for you to send their child's records to the state Medicaid agency. Let's go through the notice first. Okay, so the notice has these general rules to it. Now, these are the couple of slides that have a lot of text on them, and I apologize for that. It's not nearly as much text as in the regulation itself, but here we go. The notice must describe the consent that you're going to ask the parents to grant. Okay, parents, we're going to participate in the school Medicaid program, and we're going to ask you to consent to sending your child's records as part of that program. So you have to describe the consent. You have to tell the parents that they may withdraw their consent at any time. Parents, if you grant consent and we are sending your child's records to the state Medicaid agency, you can come in and withdraw that consent at any time. Also, if they don't grant consent or they come in later and withdraw it, you have to let them know that you are still, as a school district, obligated to provide those services to their child at no cost to them. So if the IEP calls for speech therapy, for example, and the parents either don't grant consent or they grant it and then they later withdraw it, you are still obligated as a school district to provide that speech therapy at no cost to the parents. The notice must be in the parent's native language if feasible, and that's the term they use in the regulations, if feasible. Really, it's up to every school district to determine what feasible is. I know that there are large urban school districts that support probably hundreds of different languages, and it may not be feasible to write every form used in your school district in every one of those 200 different languages. So it's up to the school district to determine what feasibility means in this. It's an annual notification, meaning you have to let the parents know about this school Medicaid program and their consent every year. The Department of Education does give you a lot of leeway in what that notification looks like. That's not part of our lunch and our topic today, but when you read through the regulation and you read through the guidance document that came out with the regulation, you see that there is lots of leeway in how you provide that notification to the parents. And last, this notice must be understandable to the general public. My biggest pet peeve with parental consent in school Medicaid around the country is this last bullet point: understandable to the general public. The general public is not all lawyers. Parents are not all lawyers. They're not all regulators. But when you read some of the notices and consents that parents are asked to sign, they look like they're written by lawyers. Well, they probably were written by lawyers, but they look like they're written for lawyers. They cite specific regulations with regulatory citations, section 3-2, subparagraph A, that kind of stuff. And I have to say, I don't know if everyone's like this, but if I ever was reading a document that cited a regulation that I'm agreeing to, I would not sign the document until I went and looked up that regulation. There is there's a lot of latitude in how you create the notice and the consent document. And there are a lot of great ways to make these understandable to the general public. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But understandable to the general public is one of the requirements for this notice. All right, let's talk about the consent now. The consent document that the parents have to sign. First, you cannot get their consent until you've provided the notice that we just talked about. Now, the notice and the consent can be on the same piece of paper, but the notice has to come first before the consent. Okay? You cannot bill for Medicaid reimbursement until you get that consent. So if you ask the parents on the first day of school in September about granting consent, you start providing all these services to their child, but they don't return that consent until February, let's say, so 4 or 5 months later, you cannot bill for reimbursement until you get that parental consent. It's a one-time consent. There is still, even though this has been 6 years, or about 6 years now, there is still a lot of misunderstanding about this. Here's how this works. A child comes into your school district today, is referred and placed in special education, starts receiving special ed services. The student's in first grade. The parents sign the consent. If that student stays in your system for the next 12 years and she graduates 12 years from now, you never, ever have to get another written parental consent. One-time consent. Now, there are two exceptions to that. One, as I said, if she's in your system continuously. If she leaves your system and formally withdraws, and then comes back, there's an interruption, so you do have to get a consent again. And remember, the parents can withdraw their consent. So if they grant consent in first grade and they withdraw it in fifth grade, for example, you cannot bill for reimbursement, or you cannot include that child's records in your reimbursement program until the parents grant consent again. But other than that, it's a one-time consent. It must be written. It cannot be implied. I worked with a large urban school district one time, and their method of granting or getting consents was to send out letters to parents, and they would say in their letter, in so many words, it would say something like, "Dear parents, we participated in the school Medicaid program. We need your consent to use your child's records. If you don't return this letter, we are assuming you're granting consent for that." That's an implied consent, and that does not work. And they're very specific in the regulations. It must be a written consent. The consent must say that the parents understand and they agree that public benefits or insurance, which means Medicaid may be accessed to pay for these services. And it must include that personally identifiable information about their child may be disclosed, things like name, birth date, gender, Medicaid ID number. Second, the purpose of the disclosure, which would be participation in the school Medicaid program, and to whom the information may be disclosed, which of course would be your state Medicaid agency. And again, if you're in a TPL state, it could be insurance companies as well. So there are two components to parental consent under IDEIA. First is the notice. That was the slide right before this, and all the rules, what that notice has to say. And then the consent itself, the consent that the parents sign, because it has to be written, and what that consent has to include. All right. Those are parental consent regulations that we've been operating under for the last 6.5 years, I guess, under IDEIA. 6.5 years ago, just about every state that had a school Medicaid program really only used IDEIA services or services listed on kids' IEPs as part of their school Medicaid program. That changed in 2014 with the advent of, missed the slide here. IDEIA services, the high points. It's an annual written notification where you have lots of different ways that you can get that notification to the parents, and it's a one-time written consent. Okay, let me get back to where I was going with the free care. 5 years ago, CMS changed their guidance to include what we call free care services. And today I'm not really going to go into what free care services are. We actually talked about that in a recent luncheon hour. But this is where a school district is providing reimbursable under Medicaid medical services that are not covered by IDEIA. And they are not listed on the kid's IEP. The student doesn't even have an IEP. So those regulations that I just described to you, the annual notice and the one-time consent, those were regulations for parental consent under IDEIA, where the services are listed on the kid's IEP. Now we're going to talk about services reimbursable under your state Medicaid plan that you're providing to kids, but they're not listed on a kid's IEP. All right? Do you still have to have parental consent before you send that kid's records to the Medicaid agency? Well, the answer is yes, you do. And let's talk about it real quick. You are going to be disclosing educational records. The nurse or whoever the medical professional is going to be delivering services. They're going to sign the service log. You're going to submit that as part of your state's school Medicaid program. You're going to be reimbursed, or somehow that's going to impact your reimbursement. You are disclosing educational records, and so you have to have parental consent per FERPA. Everybody's favorite regulation in the education world is FERPA. Now, a quick note before I dive into this in any great detail. Over the years, I have had the discussion several times about FERPA versus HIPAA. Which one applies to the confidentiality of these treatment records delivered in the school setting? Okay. Fortunately for all of us, there is a guidance document that was jointly authorized by the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And it talks about this very subject. It's actually a very easy document to read. Now, if any of you are interested in getting it, you can go out to our website, go to the resources tab. I think it's listed under additional resources, and it's HIPAA and FERPA. It's easy to find. You can also find it on the Department of Education website and the Health and Human Services websites. It makes it very clear that FERPA covers the confidentiality of these student treatment records. Okay, so FERPA is what you need to comply with. You, school district, are going to send or disclose educational treatment records to your state Medicaid agency. FERPA dictates what that confidentiality looks like, what that consent looks like, because you have to get consent to do this. Now, most of us know that school districts are required and responsible for making sure that they comply with FERPA regulations. Basically, they look at their processes, they look at any data that they might be disclosing, they look at the FERPA regulations, and they make the self-determination of whether or not they are compliant with FERPA. So there is no specific language in FERPA around school Medicaid, and there's no specific language in FERPA around school Medicaid and parental consent, like there is in IDEIA. However, there is a requirement in FERPA that a school district have written parental consent before it discloses educational records. Okay, very broad, not really quite as specific as the ones over in the special ed regulations that we just talked about. But here's what it says. One, it has to be written consent. The parents have to, or the consent has to specify the records that are covered. In this case, it could be treatment records, like a nursing visit or something like that. The purpose of the disclosure, the purpose would be participation in the school Medicaid program, and the recipients. The recipients, again, could be your state Medicaid agency, or if you're in a TPL state, it could be insurance companies that you need to send the information to before you send it to the state Medicaid agency. Okay, so if you're in a state that does not has not changed their school Medicaid program to include free care, you need to worry about the consent stuff that I talked about under IDEIA. Okay, that we talked about, one time or a notice, annual notice, and one-time consent. If you're in a free care state, states like Florida or California or Michigan, North Carolina, South Carolina, who else? Massachusetts, New Hampshire. If you're in one of those states, you may be including in your school Medicaid program records from kids covered by IDEIA, right? Services listed on their IEP, and general education kids who are receiving reimbursable services, but they're not included in special education, in which case you need to be cognizant of the parental consent regulations for both. All right. Somehow that could be confusing. I know a lot of states, when they adopt free care, they spend a lot of time explaining this stuff to the school districts so that they can build their processes. So let me spend just a couple minutes here talking about consent strategies. Okay, I'm going to take a really, not ludicrous, but far out example. Let's say that you have 100 kids receiving reimbursable services that you can include in your school Medicaid program in your school district, 100 kids, and you have 0 parents who have granted parental consent. That means you cannot include any of those kids' services in your reimbursement program, which means your reimbursement's going to be 0. Okay? So the more kids that are included, that means that you can submit records for those kids. Your reimbursement goes up. The higher the percentage, obviously you get to 100%, you are maximizing your reimbursement. You're reimbursing for every possible service you can, but you have to have valid parental consent. Now, there really should be no logical reason that you cannot get 100% of parents to grant their grant consent, right? And the operative word there is logical. You'd like to think, or I'd like to think, that I could explain something very logical to anybody and they would see the logic and they would just do what I'm asking them to do. Doesn't always work that way. I understand that. But a lot of school districts kind of take the passive route on this. They know that they need parental consent. Maybe they'll talk to the parents once or twice. Maybe they'll send them an email asking them to fill out a form and sending it back, that kind of stuff. Maybe they can get to 30 or 40% of parents granting consent in sort of that passive way, and that's kind of where they stop. Well, I've worked with enough folks from around the country who are aggressively going after that 100% of parental consents because they realize the benefits that the program has, that the revenue from the program has to the kids that they're serving. They're very passionate about that. And so I want to share some of the strategies that people have shared with me. So the first one I have there is knowing the details of the program. So everybody in your school system who might talk to parents about school Medicaid, at least at kind of a cursory level, should know the same talking points that everybody else in the school district knows. So you need to establish your talking points. Hey, when parents ask us about special or school Medicaid, this is what we're going to talk about. And then my strategy there is to actually have staff development days where they practice saying the words. Imagine that, you go, you get a document that says, hey, this is what we talk about in our school district. You read it, you put it in your folder, and 4 weeks later, somebody actually asks you a question. And you think, holy cow, that's on that sheet of paper. Let me get that out real quick. Let me see if I can find it. Well, if you haven't practiced saying those words, they're not going to come across in a very authoritative way. So establish your talking points, make sure everybody has them, have a staff professional workshop so people can practice saying them aloud to each other before they have to say them to parents the first time. Next one is to have materials for parents, specifically written for parents as the audience, either a program brochure or a special page on your website, or both, that are specifically written for parents. Think of the kind of questions that parents ask, because I guess they're going to ask the same questions over and over. That's how the materials should be focused on either your brochures or your web page. And that goes with the next bullet, an FAQ document. If I walked into 100 school districts today and I said, give me the top 10 questions that parents ask you about school Medicaid, I would probably get 8 questions from all 100 school districts, and then they'd all have lots of variations. Put that together for your own school district. Frequently asked questions that parents ask. If you've been participating in school Medicaid for years, you know what they are. Put down then the answer from the school district's perspective. This makes that talking points document from my first bullet really easy, because you're going to give the parents this FAQ document, which is the same document that your staff talks from when parents ask them questions. Make sure that your materials are understandable to the parents, especially the notice and consent under the IDEIA. Okay. Again, that's my number one pet peeve. Whenever I talk to a school district and they're asking me about strategies that they can use to increase their parental consent percentages, I always ask them to send me their notice and consent, and the majority of the time they look like they are written for lawyers or legislators or regulators, that kind of stuff. And you need to really take those documents and make them parent friendly. You can meet all the regulations and still have a very readable, understandable document. Now, the last one here is a really neat tool. I've seen it a couple different times. The one that I can remember off the top of my head is in Virginia. And in Virginia, they have a letter. It's on state letterhead, and I believe the last time I looked, it was signed by the state Medicaid commissioner, and it's a letter written to parents, kind of an open letter to parents. It describes the school Medicaid program, describes the benefits that the school Medicaid program brings to the school districts and to the individual students in the state. And, having a state level authoritative document like this is a great tool for school districts and then your staff at the school district who have to talk to the parents. All right, my last one here is to actively pursue consent. I already talked a little bit about kind of that passive approach. A lot of school districts do the letter thing. We're going to send out 100 letters, and if we get 25 back where people have signed for consent, that's great. We're not really going to do much more than that. And so a lot of school districts have settled over the years for 25% or 40% of consents and not really gone after the other ones. Now, I've worked with some administrators over the years who make it their mission to get 100% consents if they can. And they do that because they understand the benefits that revenue brings to the kids in the district. So here are a couple of them. One, when families come in to register their kids in the school district, they're new to the school district, they're new to the area, and they register their kids, talking to them about the school Medicaid program, giving them the notice at the time, something like that. That's a great way to introduce it, answering questions. And of course, if you have a very small number of people who actively register new kids when the parents are there, then you have some folks that you can really work with professional development to make sure that they understand the program and the questions that the parents ask. Parent-teacher conferences is another great place. We have a list of students that we don't have consent from their parents. And we're going to have parent-teacher conferences, and we look and assign, here's the classroom teacher, and she knows that Mr. and Mrs. Jones are coming in, and that's a family that we need to get parental consent. And at the end of the parent-teacher conference, she says, if you don't mind, for a couple minutes, my assistant principal would like to talk to you real quick about the school Medicaid program. The parents are there. You've got somebody there who can readily talk about the school Medicaid program and explain the details. Great time. I worked with a special education director for a large suburban school district in Texas, as a matter of fact. She made it her mission to get 100% of consents. And her last strategy, when everything else failed, was to get in her car, set an appointment with the parents after work, after dinner, and go to their house and talk to them about school Medicaid. And again, it was her last strategy. She had all kinds of other strategies. She had almost 100% consents too. So she didn't have to do this every night, but it was that important to her to bring in that revenue from the program that she would get in her car and go do that. And then the last one here is one that somebody gave me. Working with your parent-teacher organization, whatever it's called in your school district, making sure that the PTA or the PTO, that they clearly understand the school Medicaid program, getting the PTA to author a document to other parents about the school Medicaid program and the benefits that it's brought, and the programs that have been paid for by this revenue, or the equipment that's been paid for, or the staff positions that have been funded by this program. You get that sort of document or level of comfort with the parent-teacher organization. Those are people that other parents are going to ask about the program, and that is a great strategy. Okay, so today I've talked a little bit about the regulations around parental consent, the regulations for IDEIA-based services, and the regulations for consent around free care services, or services that are being provided that are not listed on kids' IEPs. And then I also gave you a list of some strategies that school districts have shared with me that have really worked for them in getting higher percentages of parents to grant consent. Now, in just a minute when the luncheon hour ends, you guys will probably all get an email thanking you for being here, and that includes a link to our online feedback form. Really do appreciate if you would just click the link and answer the questions. It's 6 or 7 questions about today's topic. Was it good information? Was it not good information? Was Bob a good speaker or a poor speaker? Feel free to really let loose. I will say that is the way that we add new topics to the luncheon hour and improve the content. Now, if you don't want to wait for the email to show up, you can go out to our website, go to the About menu. Down at the bottom, there's a link to the workshop feedback. It takes you to that exact same survey. It's anonymous. You don't have to tell me who you are if you don't want to, but we really do appreciate the feedback. So here's my contact information again. Anybody has questions, anybody wants to discuss consent or anything else with school Medicaid, please feel free to give me a call, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future luncheon hour.